The day I came home to find my spare snow plow blade missing from my garage, I knew exactly who was responsible, and I also knew that this time they had gone too far. I had been living in the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Boulder, Colorado, for about 3 years. When I first moved in, the place seemed perfect. The houses were well maintained, the streets were clean, and the mountain views were spectacular. But within the first 6 months, I learned what every other homeowner in the neighborhood already knew. Our HOA president, Brenda Morrison, was a nightmare with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. My name is Prescott, and I work as a commercial electrician. The hours are long, the work is demanding, and the last thing I want to deal with when I get home is someone telling me that my trash cans are the wrong shade of brown, or that my Christmas lights are 3 days past the acceptable removal date. But Brenda seemed to take personal offense to my very existence in her perfect little kingdom. It started small. A notice about my lawn being a 1/4 inch too long. A complaint that my truck, which I parked in my own driveway, was too commercial looking despite being a standard pickup that half the neighborhood drove. A citation because I left my garage door open while I unloaded groceries for more than the allotted 15 minutes. Yes, 15 minutes. She actually stood there with a timer, but the plow blade situation was different. That was theft, plain and simple. I had bought the spare blade last winter during a clearance sale at a farm supply store just outside Denver. The thing cost me $800, even on sale, but in Colorado, having a backup for your plow equipment is just common sense. I used my truck for a small side business during winter, clearing driveways for elderly neighbors and some local businesses. The extra income helped offset the ridiculous HOA fees we paid every month. The blade had been sitting in my garage, tucked against the far wall, not bothering anyone. My garage door was closed most of the time, and even when it was open, the blade was barely visible behind my workbench. But somehow, Brenda had decided it violated some obscure rule in the HOA covenant about storing commercial equipment on residential property. I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon in early April to find the garage door standing wide open. My first thought was that I had been robbed. I rushed inside, my heart pounding, checking for my tools, my equipment, anything valuable. Everything else was there. Just the plow blade was gone. There was a notice taped to my workbench. I recognized the HOA letterhead immediately. The letter, signed by Brenda Morrison in her annoyingly perfect cursive, informed me that the commercial equipment stored in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 7 of the HOA covenants had been removed and impounded for the safety and aesthetic integrity of the community. If I wanted to retrieve my property, I could contact the HOA office to discuss the matter and pay the associated fines and storage fees. I read the letter 3 times, my anger building with each pass. They had entered my property. They had taken my equipment. And now they wanted me to pay them for the privilege. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA office. It rang 4 times before Brenda's overly cheerful voice answered. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, this is Brenda speaking. How may I help you today? Brenda, this is Prescott. You broke into my garage and stole my property. There was a pause, and I could practically hear her smile through the phone. Mr. Prescott, I hardly think that language is appropriate. The HOA board took necessary action to address a clear violation of our community standards. Your garage door was found open, and the commercial equipment visible from the street was in violation of our covenants. My garage door was closed, and even if it was open, you do not have the right to enter my property and take my belongings. Actually, Mr. Prescott, If you review Section 18 of the covenants, you will see that the HOA board has the authority to enter any property within the community to address immediate violations that impact community standards. Your equipment was creating an eyesore and potentially devaluing your neighbors' homes. It was in my garage, behind my workbench. Nobody could see it. Nevertheless, it was in violation. You may retrieve your equipment by scheduling an appointment with the board, acknowledging the violation, and paying the $200 fine plus the $50 per day storage fee. I took a deep breath, trying to control my temper. So let me get this straight. You broke into my garage, stole my $800 plow blade, and now you want me to pay you $250 to get it back. $300, actually. Today is the second day of storage, and I resent the accusation of theft, Mr. Prescott. This is standard HOA enforcement procedure. We'll see what the police have to say about that. The local police are well aware of our community standards, Mr. Prescott. Several officers live in this neighborhood. I'm sure they'll agree that we acted appropriately. The board meeting is next Monday at 7. You're welcome to present your concerns then. Have a wonderful day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood in my garage, staring at the empty space where my plow blade had been, and made a decision. If Brenda wanted to play hardball, I could play too, but I was going to be smarter about it. First, I called the Boulder Police non-emergency line. The officer who answered listened to my story with what sounded like practiced patience. When I finished, he sighed. "Sir, if this is an HOA matter, we typically don't get involved unless there's a clear criminal violation. Since they're claiming authorization under your community covenants, this is really a civil matter. You would need to take it up with the HOA board or possibly pursue legal action." They took my property. How is that not theft? I understand your frustration, sir, but HOAs have certain legal authorities granted by the covenants you signed when you purchased your home. If you believe they overstepped, you need to address it through the proper channels. My advice would be to attend the next board meeting and request your property back. If they refuse, consult with an attorney. I thanked him and hung up, more frustrated than before. I sat down at my kitchen table and pulled up the HOA covenants on my laptop. The document was 63 pages of dense legal language, clearly written by attorneys who billed by the word. But I started reading. Section 18, which Brenda had cited, did grant the HOA board the right to enter properties to address immediate violations. However, the section specifically defined immediate violations as those posing health hazards, safety risks, or severe aesthetic impacts visible from public areas. My plow blade, tucked in my garage, hardly qualified. More importantly, Section 18 required written notice and a minimum 48-hour response period before the HOA could take any action. I had received no such notice. And then there was Section 12, Paragraph 7, which Brenda claimed my plow blade violated. I found the section and read it carefully. It prohibited the storage of commercial vehicles or equipment in visible outdoor locations. Visible. Outdoor. My blade had been inside my garage. I grabbed my phone and took pictures of the empty space in my garage, the notice Brenda had left, and the section of the covenants that I believed proved they had no legal right to take my property. Then, I did something else. I remembered the serial number on my plow blade. I had written it down when I bought the blade, along with all the purchase information, for insurance purposes. I kept a detailed inventory of all my tools and equipment, complete with serial numbers, purchase dates, and receipts. It was a habit I had developed after my apartment was burglarized when I was in my 20s, and it had served me well over the years. I pulled out my equipment log and found the entry for the plow blade. Western Products Model 8600, serial number WP 8600147832, 2024. I had the receipt too, showing I had purchased it legally for $812 on January 15th of the previous year. An idea started forming. It was risky, but if Brenda wanted to play games, I was going to play to win. Over the next few days, I did my research. I learned that in Colorado, snow plow blades are considered agricultural equipment, which requires registration with the state if they are going to be used commercially. More importantly, if such equipment is sold or transferred, the transaction must be reported to the state agricultural equipment registry. This was primarily to prevent theft and illegal resale of expensive farm and construction equipment. I also learned that if someone was in possession of registered equipment without proper documentation of ownership transfer, they could face significant fines. The state took equipment theft seriously, especially in rural and mountain communities where such equipment was essential for business operations. My plow blade was registered. I had filed the paperwork when I started my snow removal side business to ensure everything was legal and above board. The registration was in my name, with my address, and the serial number clearly documented. On Thursday afternoon, I called the Colorado Department of Agriculture's Equipment Registration Office. A woman named Sarah answered and listened as I explained my situation. "So let me make sure I understand," she said. "Your HOA took your registered plow blade without your permission, and they're currently storing it at an undisclosed location. That's correct. They claim it's impounded for HOA violations, but they never provided proper notice, and the equipment was stored legally on my property. Mr. Prescott, if your equipment is registered and someone has taken possession of it without a documented transfer of ownership, that's a serious matter. Can you provide me with the serial number and registration information?" I read her the information from my log. I heard typing on the other end of the line. "Yes, I have your registration here. The equipment is listed as a Western Products Model 8600, currently registered to Connor Prescott at 847 Meadowbrook Lane, Boulder. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's my address. And you're saying your HOA has taken possession of this equipment without your authorization, correct?" They left me a notice saying I could pay fines and storage fees to get it back, but they never provided the legally required notice before taking it, and the equipment wasn't actually in violation of the covenants they cited. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Prescott, I'm going to need you to file a formal report. If your HOA is holding registered agricultural equipment without proper documentation, they're in violation of state law. The fine for possessing registered equipment without proper transfer documentation is $5,000, and that's for a first offense. We take equipment theft very seriously." "I'm not sure they realize it's registered," I said. "To them, it's probably just a hunk of metal they think violates their community standards. That's irrelevant. Ignorance of the law isn't an excuse. If you want to pursue this, I'll need you to submit a formal report through our website. Include copies of your registration, proof of purchase, and any documentation from your HOA regarding the seizure of your equipment. We'll investigate from there." "How long does the investigation usually take?" "Given that this is pretty straightforward, probably 2 to 3 weeks. If we determine that your equipment is indeed being held without proper documentation, we'll contact the party in possession and issue a citation. They'll have the option to return the equipment immediately and pay a reduced fine, or contest the citation. If they contest and lose, The fine increases significantly. I thanked Sarah and hung up, feeling the first real sense of satisfaction I had felt since this whole thing started. I spent the next hour filling out the online report form, uploading scans of all my documentation, and providing a detailed account of what had happened. Monday evening arrived, and I made sure to show up at the HOA board meeting 15 minutes early. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a nice building near the neighborhood pool. When I walked in, Brenda was already there, arranging papers at the head table with two other board members I recognized: Tom Whitaker, the treasurer, and Patricia Chen, the secretary. About a dozen other homeowners were scattered around the room. I recognized most of them by sight, though I didn't know many of them well. I worked long hours, and I generally kept to myself. Brenda looked up when I entered and gave me a thin smile. "Good evening, Mr. Prescott. I'm glad you could join us." I nodded but didn't respond. I took a seat in the back row and waited. The meeting started with the usual routine business. Minutes from the last meeting were approved. Tom gave a boring financial report. Patricia read through a list of upcoming neighborhood events. Finally, they moved to homeowner concerns. "Before we open the floor," Brenda said, "I want to address an enforcement action the board took last week. We removed commercial equipment from a property that was in violation of our community covenants. The homeowner in question has been notified and has the opportunity to retrieve his property by acknowledging the violation and paying the associated fines." She didn't mention my name, but she looked directly at me when she said it. "Now, if anyone has concerns they'd like to bring before the board," she continued, "please raise your hand and wait to be recognized." I raised my hand. Brenda's smile got even thinner. "Yes, Mr. Prescott," I stood up. "I want to discuss the theft of my property by this board." Several homeowners turned to look at me. Brenda's smile disappeared entirely. "Mr. Prescott, as I've explained to you, the removal of your equipment was not theft. It was a legally authorized enforcement action." "Really?" "Because Section 18 of our covenants requires written notice and a 48-hour response period before the HOA can enter a property. I received no such notice. And Section 12, Paragraph 7, which you claim I violated, only prohibits visible outdoor storage of commercial equipment. My plow blade was inside my garage, behind my workbench. It wasn't visible from the street or anywhere else." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Patricia was looking down at her papers, suddenly very interested in something on the page in front of her. Brenda, however, didn't miss a beat. "Your garage door was found open, making the equipment visible from the street, and the 48-hour notice period can be waived in cases of immediate violations. My garage door was not open, and even if it had been, a plow blade sitting in someone's garage is hardly an immediate violation." What was the immediate danger? Was someone going to be crushed by the sight of it? A few people in the audience chuckled. Brenda's face reddened. "Mr. Prescott, your sarcasm is not helpful. The board acted in accordance with our covenants and our responsibility to maintain community standards. If you disagree with our interpretation, you're free to pursue legal action. But unless you're willing to pay the fines and acknowledge the violation, you will not be getting your equipment back." "We'll see about that," I said, sitting back down. The meeting continued, but I barely paid attention. I had said what I needed to say. More importantly, I had gotten Brenda on record in front of witnesses, admitting that the HOA had my property and was refusing to return it without payment of fines. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. I checked my email obsessively, waiting for any update from the Colorado Department of Agriculture. I also consulted with an attorney, a guy named Mike Reeves, who had handled a real estate issue for me when I first bought my house. He listened to my story and reviewed the documentation I had put together. "You've got a solid case," he said. "They clearly violated their own covenant procedures, and the equipment wasn't in violation to begin with. But here's the thing. Taking them to court will cost you more in legal fees than the blade is worth. Even if you win, you might not recover all your costs. HOA cases are notoriously expensive and time-consuming." "I'm not doing this for the money," I said. "I'm doing this because Brenda Morrison needs to learn that she can't just steal people's property whenever she feels like it." Mike nodded. "I get it, and for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, but be prepared for this to get ugly. HOA boards have a lot of legal protections, and they often have deeper pockets than individual homeowners. If you want to pursue this, I'll help you, but I want you to understand what you're getting into." "I understand. But I've already set something else in motion that might resolve this without going to court." I told him about my report to the Department of Agriculture. Mike's eyebrows went up. "That's clever. I don't think I've ever seen someone use the agricultural equipment registry that way. But you're right. If they're holding registered equipment without proper documentation, that's a serious violation. The state doesn't mess around with that stuff. That's what I'm counting on." On a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after my plow blade was taken, I got the email I had been waiting for. It was from Sarah at the Department of Agriculture. "Mr. Prescott, our investigation into your report has been completed. We have confirmed that the Western Products plow blade, serial number WP 8600147832, 2024, is registered in your name, and that the Meadowbrook Estates HOA has taken possession of this equipment without proper transfer documentation. A citation has been issued to the HOA for unlawful possession of registered agricultural equipment. The fine is $5,000. The HOA has been notified and given 10 days to either return the equipment to you and pay a reduced fine of $2,500 or contest the citation at a hearing. We have also noted in our report that the HOA appears to have entered your property without proper notice as required by their own covenants, which may constitute additional legal violations. Please let me know if you need any further assistance." I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a smile. $5,000, or $2,500 if they returned my blade and admitted fault. Either way, Brenda was going to lose this one. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:30. Brenda's voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "Mr. Prescott, what have you done?" "Good morning, Brenda. I'm not sure what you mean." "Do not play games with me. The HOA received a citation from the state yesterday for $5,000. They're claiming we're in possession of stolen agricultural equipment." "Not stolen. Just registered. There's a difference. My plow blade is registered with the state as required for commercial use. When you took it without my permission and without proper documentation of ownership transfer, you violated state law. The Department of Agriculture takes that pretty seriously." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Brenda spoke again, her voice was colder. "This is ridiculous. It's a plow blade, not a tractor. This registration requirement clearly isn't meant for something that small. Actually, the law is very clear. Any equipment used commercially for agricultural purposes, which includes snow removal in Colorado, must be registered. I followed the law. You didn't. If you want to contest the citation, you're welcome to request a hearing. But based on my research, the state hasn't lost one of these cases in over 5 years." Another long silence. "What do you want, Mr. Prescott?" I want my property returned immediately with no fines or fees. I also want a written apology from the board acknowledging that my equipment was not in violation of the covenants, and that the board acted improperly by taking it without proper notice. And I want a formal policy change to prevent this kind of abuse from happening to other homeowners in the future. That's outrageous. The board will never agree to that. Then, I guess you'll be paying the $5,000 fine. Oh, and I should mention that my attorney is preparing a civil suit for illegal seizure of property, violation of the HOA's own covenants, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. That's going to cost you a lot more than $5,000, especially if we end up in court and other homeowners start coming forward with their own complaints about the board's overreach. I've done my research, Brenda. You've been pulling this kind of thing for years. How many people has the board fined for made-up violations? How much money have you collected through bogus enforcement actions? I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, the fight had gone out of her voice. I'll need to consult with the rest of the board. You have until Monday. That's when the 10-day deadline starts for responding to the state citation. If I don't have my blade back by then with everything else I've requested, I'm moving forward with the lawsuit and you can pay the full fine to the state. She hung up without another word. That weekend felt like the longest of my life. I kept expecting my phone to ring, expecting some kind of response, but there was nothing. I worked around the house, caught up on some projects I had been putting off, and tried not to obsess over what the board might be planning. Monday morning arrived. I was getting ready for work when my doorbell rang at 6:45. I opened the door to find Tom Whitaker, the HOA treasurer, standing on my porch. He looked uncomfortable and tired. "Mr. Prescott, I'm sorry to bother you so early. The board had an emergency meeting last night. We'd like to resolve this situation." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. Tom entered and stood awkwardly in my entryway. He was carrying a folder and what looked like a check. "First, let me say that some of us on the board were not aware of all the details regarding your plow blade situation. Brenda handled the enforcement action independently, which she technically has the authority to do as president, but the rest of us weren't informed until after the fact. When we received the citation from the state, we conducted a thorough review of what happened. And you're right, the blade wasn't in violation. It was stored inside your garage, which is allowed. And we should have provided you with written notice and a response period before taking any action, even if there had been a legitimate violation. Brenda made a mistake." "Brenda made several mistakes," I said. "The question is, what is the board going to do about it?" Tom opened the folder and pulled out several documents. "We're prepared to return your plow blade today. It's currently in storage at a facility on the west side of town. We'll provide you with the address and arrange for immediate access. We're also waiving all fines and fees. This check is for $500, which represents reimbursement for your time and any expenses you incurred dealing with this matter." I looked at the check. It was made out to me for $500, signed by Tom as treasurer. "What about the written apology and the policy changes?" Tom pulled out another document. "Here's a letter, signed by all 3 board members, acknowledging that the board acted improperly and that your equipment was not in violation of any covenants. We're also implementing new procedures that require a full board vote before any enforcement actions involving entry onto private property or seizure of personal belongings. Any homeowner facing enforcement will receive written notice and a minimum of 72 hours to respond before any action is taken." I read through the letter and the new policy document. It was everything I had asked for and more. The apology was genuine and specific about what the board had done wrong. The new policies were comprehensive and would make it much harder for any future board president to abuse their authority the way Brenda had. "This is good," I said. "What about the state citation?" "We're paying the reduced fine and admitting fault. The citation will be resolved by the end of the week." "And Brenda," Tom sighed. "That's complicated. Technically, she acted within her authority as president, even if she made bad decisions about how to apply that authority. We can't remove her from the board without a vote of the homeowners. But between you and me, several of us are planning to push for her resignation. At a minimum, we're going to propose restricting the president's independent enforcement authority. This kind of thing can't happen again." I studied Tom's face. He seemed sincere, and the documents he had brought were more than I had hoped to get without going to court. "Okay," I said. "I accept these terms. Get me the address for the storage facility. I want my blade back today." Tom nodded, clearly relieved. He handed me a piece of paper with an address on the west side of Boulder. "The facility manager is expecting you. Just show him your ID and mention the HOA account. He'll release the blade to you immediately." After Tom left, I called my supervisor and told him I'd be a couple hours late. Then I drove across town to the storage facility. It was a large industrial complex filled with construction equipment, landscaping supplies, and various other items. The manager, a gruff older guy named Ed, met me at the office. "You must be Prescott," he said. "Hold on, I'll get your blade." He disappeared into the back of the facility and returned a few minutes later driving a forklift with my plow blade secured on the forks. He set it down next to my truck, and I spent the next 15 minutes securing it in the bed. "If you don't mind me saying," Ed said as I worked, "your HOA has some real nerve. They brought this in here 3 weeks ago, told me it was seized property and that they'd be storing it indefinitely. Paid me for 3 months of storage up front. Then last week, some state inspector shows up asking questions about it. I told him the truth, that some HOA brought it in and claimed they had the right to take it from a homeowner. He did not look happy." "I bet he didn't," I said. "Thanks for being straight with him." "Hey, I run a legitimate business. I'm not going to help anyone store stolen property, HOA or not. Glad you got your stuff back." I drove home with my plow blade secured in the truck bed, feeling better than I had in weeks. When I got home, I took photos of the blade back in my garage, properly stored behind my workbench where it had been before all this started. Then, I sent an email to Sarah at the Department of Agriculture, thanking her for her help and confirming that my property had been returned. But I wasn't done yet. That evening, I drafted a long email detailing everything that had happened, from Brenda's harassment over the years to the illegal seizure of my plow blade to the resolution. I sent it to every homeowner in the neighborhood whose email address I could find. I also posted it on the neighborhood Facebook group and the community forum on the HOA website. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, I had dozens of replies. Other homeowners started sharing their own stories of Brenda's overreach. One neighbor had been fined $300 because his lawn had turned brown during a drought, despite the city imposing watering restrictions. Another had received a violation notice because her daughter drew a hopscotch grid on their driveway with washable chalk. A third had been threatened with legal action because he installed a small vegetable garden in his backyard, which Brenda claimed violated aesthetic standards, even though the garden wasn't visible from any public area. The stories kept coming. Brenda had created a culture of fear and petty tyranny in what should have been a peaceful neighborhood. And now that someone had finally stood up to her and won, everyone else felt empowered to speak up too. The next HOA board meeting, 2 weeks later, was packed. Every seat in the clubhouse was filled, and people were standing along the walls. The energy in the room was tense but focused. Brenda sat at the head table looking pale and defensive. Tom and Patricia flanked her, both looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. When the meeting was called to order, homeowners immediately started raising their hands. Brenda tried to maintain control, insisting they follow proper procedure and wait for the homeowner comment period, but people were having none of it. "Point of order," called out a man I recognized from 3 streets over. "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Morrison." "Second," shouted a woman near the front. Brenda's face went white. "That's not how this works. You can't just call for a vote without proper notice." "Actually," Tom said quietly, "they can. The bylaws allow for a no-confidence vote to be called from the floor with a simple second. All homeowners present are eligible to vote." Brenda turned to glare at him, but Tom wouldn't meet her eyes. The vote was held by show of hands. It wasn't even close. Out of roughly 60 homeowners present, only 3 voted in Brenda's favor. The rest voted for her removal. Brenda stood up, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This is ridiculous. I have done nothing but work to maintain the standards of this community. I have spent countless hours dealing with violations, organizing events, and trying to protect your property values. And this is the thanks I get. You abused your authority," someone called out. "You treated us like children who needed to be controlled." "You stole someone's property," another voice added. "You cost this HOA thousands of dollars in fines and legal expenses because you couldn't admit when you were wrong," said a third. Brenda grabbed her papers and her purse. "Fine. You want to run this community without me? Good luck. See how long it takes before this place falls apart." She stormed out of the clubhouse. The room was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. The applause spread until the entire room was clapping and cheering. Tom stood up and called for order. "Okay, everyone. We still have business to conduct. We need to elect a new president, and we need to address some of the other concerns that have been raised tonight." The meeting went on for another 2 hours. A woman named Jennifer Torres was elected as the new president. She was a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years and had always been friendly and reasonable. Her first act as president was to propose a complete review of all HOA enforcement actions from the past 3 years, with refunds issued to anyone who had been inappropriately fined. I went home that night feeling like a weight had been lifted not just from my shoulders, but from the entire neighborhood. The HOA had been transformed from a source of stress and anxiety into what it was supposed to be all along: a community organization focused on maintaining common areas and organizing positive activities for residents. But there was still one more shoe to drop. About a week after Brenda's removal, I got a call from a detective with the Boulder Police Department. Her name was Detective Karen Hughes, and she wanted to talk to me about the HOA situation. "Mr. Prescott, I understand you filed a report with the State Department of Agriculture regarding agricultural equipment that was taken from your property." "That's correct. Is there a problem?" "Not with your report. But during the investigation, some additional information came to light that we're looking into. Would you be able to come down to the station to answer some questions?" I felt a flutter of nervousness. "Am I in trouble?" "No, not at all. We're investigating the HOA, not you. But you have information that might be helpful." I agreed to meet her the next day. When I arrived at the police station, Detective Hughes led me to a small interview room and offered me coffee, which I declined. "Mr. Prescott, I want to be upfront with you about why you're here. When the state agriculture inspector investigated your complaint, He noticed something odd about the storage facility where your plow blade was being held. The HOA had paid for 3 months of storage up front, which the facility manager found unusual. He also mentioned that your HOA had stored other items there over the past year. Other items, construction equipment, lawn maintenance tools, even a small boat, all of it supposedly seized from homeowners for covenant violations. We started looking into it, and we discovered that none of that equipment was ever returned to the homeowners. The HOA would seize items, store them for a few months, then sell them. The money from the sales went into an HOA account, but it was never reported in the financial statements provided to homeowners. I sat back in my chair, stunned. Brenda was stealing people's property and selling it. That's what it looks like. We've identified at least 6 cases over the past 2 years where the HOA seized property from homeowners, claimed it was in violation of covenants, and then disposed of it without returning it to the owners. In some cases, the homeowners paid the fines and fees demanded by the HOA, but the property was never returned. They were told it had been destroyed or donated. That's theft. That's fraud. Yes, it is. And because the total value of the property involved exceeds $5,000, it's a felony. We're building a case against Brenda Morrison. What we need from you is a detailed account of what happened with your plow blade, including any communications you had with Morrison and any documentation you have. I spent the next hour going through everything with Detective Hughes. I provided her with copies of all my emails, the notice Brenda had left in my garage, the HOA meeting minutes where she admitted to taking my property, and the eventual resolution documents Tom had given me. "This is excellent," Detective Hughes said. "Your documentation is some of the best we have. Most of the other victims didn't keep such detailed records. Can I ask how you knew to register your plow blade with the state? That's what really broke this case open. I run a small snow removal business in the winter. When I looked into what I needed to do to operate legally, I found out about the registration requirement. It seemed like a pain at the time, but I'm glad I did it. You should be. If you hadn't, we might never have caught on to what Morrison was doing. The state inspector who handled your case is the one who noticed the other equipment at the storage facility and contacted us. Over the next several weeks, the investigation expanded. Police interviewed dozens of homeowners and reviewed years of HOA records. They discovered that Brenda had been running the scheme for nearly 3 years. She would identify homeowners who had valuable equipment or property that could be deemed in violation of the covenants. She would seize the items, often without proper notice, and store them at the facility across town. After a few months, when the homeowners had given up on getting their property back, she would sell the items through online marketplaces or to used equipment dealers. The money would go into a separate HOA account that she controlled, which she claimed was for emergency repairs and special projects. In reality, she had been siphoning off portions of the money for her own use. The total value of the stolen property exceeded $23,000. Brenda had pocketed about $8,000 of that over 3 years, using the money for personal expenses, vacations, and home improvements. In early June, Brenda Morrison was arrested and charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The charges were serious enough that she was looking at potential prison time if convicted. The arrest made the local news. I watched the coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because Brenda was finally being held accountable for what she had done. Sadness because it never should have gotten to this point. If the HOA board had provided proper oversight, if homeowners had felt empowered to push back against her abuses earlier, Maybe it could have been stopped before it escalated to criminal activity. But there was no point in dwelling on what might have been. The important thing was that it was over now, and the neighborhood could move forward. The new HOA board, under Jennifer's leadership, was night and day different from what we had endured under Brenda. The focus shifted away from enforcement and control, and toward community building and reasonable maintenance of shared spaces. Violation notices became rare and were only issued for legitimate problems after multiple friendly attempts to address issues directly with homeowners. The mood in the neighborhood improved noticeably. In July, the HOA held a community barbecue at the clubhouse. It was the first neighborhood event I had actually wanted to attend since moving in. I brought a dish to share and spent the afternoon talking with neighbors I had only known as faces I waved to from my truck. People were friendly and relaxed in a way I had never seen before. Jennifer pulled me aside at one point. "Connor, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Standing up to Brenda took guts, and I'm not sure anyone else would have done it. You changed this community for the better." "I just wanted my plow blade back," I said with a smile. "It was more than that, and you know it. You held the board accountable. You showed everyone that we don't have to accept abuse from people in positions of authority just because they have a title and a clipboard. That matters." She was right, of course, but I hadn't set out to be a crusader or a hero. I had just been a guy who was tired of being pushed around and who happened to know how to push back effectively. Brenda's criminal case moved through the system over the summer and fall. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor held firm. With the amount of money involved and the number of victims, the charges were serious. In October, Brenda finally pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison, followed by probation, and ordered to pay full restitution to all the homeowners whose property she had stolen and sold. The restitution payments were slow to materialize since Brenda claimed she didn't have the money, but the court placed liens on her property and garnished her income. Most of the victims, myself included, didn't really care about getting the money back. The satisfaction came from seeing justice served. As winter approached and the first snow began to fall in the mountains above Boulder, I pulled out my plow blade and attached it to my truck. The sight of it always made me smile now. What had started as a simple piece of equipment had become a symbol of standing up for what's right, of not backing down when someone abuses their authority, and of the importance of knowing your rights and the law. I drove through the neighborhood one evening after a light snowfall, clearing driveways for some of the elderly residents who couldn't manage it themselves. Several people waved and thanked me as I worked. One woman, Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over, brought me hot chocolate and cookies. "You're a good man, Connor," she said. "We're lucky to have you in this neighborhood." "I'm just glad things worked out," I replied. "It's more than that. You reminded us all that we have power when we stand together, that we don't have to accept it when people abuse their authority." That's a valuable lesson. As I drove home that evening, my plow blade scraping the last remnants of snow from the streets, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past year. It had started with anger and frustration over a stolen piece of equipment. It had escalated into a battle over principles and community standards. And it had ended with real change, not just in our HOA, but in how homeowners viewed their rights and responsibilities. The spare plow blade sat in my garage now, right where it had always been, behind my workbench. I had thought about moving it to a more visible location, just to make a point, but decided against it. There was no need for that anymore. The people who needed to learn the lesson had learned it. The rest of us could just go about our lives, living in a community that actually functioned the way it was supposed to. I had learned something valuable too. Sometimes standing up for yourself means doing your homework, knowing the law, and being willing to use the system to your advantage. It means not backing down just because someone has a title or claims authority. And it means recognizing that individual actions can have broader impacts, even when that's not your primary intention. My plow blade had become more than just a tool for clearing snow. It had become a symbol of resistance against petty tyranny, of the importance of documentation and knowing your rights, and of the power individuals have when they refuse to be bullied. As I settled in for the evening, I received an email from Jennifer with the subject line, "Holiday Party Planning." The new HOA board was organizing a holiday party for mid-December and wanted input from residents about activities and food. It was exactly the kind of thing an HOA should be focused on, bringing people together and building community rather than tearing it down with excessive rules and enforcement. I replied with some suggestions and then sat back to enjoy the peace and quiet of my home. Outside, snow was falling steadily, covering the neighborhood in a fresh white blanket. Tomorrow I would be out early, clearing driveways and making extra money with my side business. And I would do it all with my properly registered, legally owned, completely legitimate plow blade attached to my truck, stored each night in my garage exactly where it belonged. Brenda Morrison had tried to steal more than just my property. She had tried to steal my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to live peacefully in my own home. But in the end, she had failed. The system had worked, justice had been served, and our community was better for it. Sometimes the smallest things can lead to the biggest changes. A spare plow blade gathering dust in a garage had toppled a tyrant, exposed a criminal enterprise, and transformed a neighborhood. It wasn't the ending anyone could have predicted when this all started, but it was the right ending. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I made a mental note to check the serial numbers on all my other equipment and make sure everything was properly documented and registered. You never know when that kind of information might come in handy. And after everything I had been through, I was taking no chances. The snow continued to fall through the night, and I slept better than I had in months, knowing that my property was secure, my rights were intact, and my neighborhood was finally in good hands. Justice had prevailed, the criminals were punished, and life could go on. Sometimes that is all you can ask for, and sometimes that is everything.